resume. The one and only needs no introduction, Harvey Rishikof.
Thank you, Bobby. First, let me thank you, Bobby, for putting this together. So we have always envisioned this as an opportunity to bring together different intellectual disciplines. We call it the lawyer jirga, and we've had a whole range of topics over the last 5 or 6 years. And as Jamie Baker opened up the session and demonstrated, so we think this is sort of critical because the way you think about doctrine is the way the next generation of students will be educated. And what makes this particular lawyer jirga fascinating is we call it the geek-wonk bridge, and that it's become an issue for not only the academy, but law firms. So I'm with a law firm now, and the law firms are trying to struggle to think through how to make their offerings to their clients and at the same time monetize the issue. And the third group, which hasn't been mentioned, which is also a critical group, are the business schools. Because the governance structure is a huge issue. I sit on a number of boards. And if you sit on a board of a large institution, how you think through this issue of cyber exposure is quite an issue. And because you're worried about, we always tell you the tall pole in the tent is liability issues. And that's what draws together the different disciplines. And we have a great group of people that are going to be able to talk about this. On my left, I have is Kristen, who has been introduced before from UCLA. We also have Andrew from the University of Kentucky, who was on earlier on yesterday's panel. And we're very lucky to have Matt Kermit today. And Matt is the head of global and policy development at Facebook. So you have a real sense of the practitioner issues and the policy issue. So the title of this particular section is Cyber in the Business and Regulatory Context. So it might be nice to start off with Matt from Facebook, but I don't want to put you on the pressure.
Because I was added to this panel 30 seconds ago.
No,
it's not on the spot at all.
So it's ready to go. So Matt, we say it's timeliness, as you know, lawyers are your friends. So, but from Facebook's perspective, and given where you sit in global policy development, because there's both domestic and international level that you confront, and I just was recently visited your campus, and you have that extraordinary wall of all of your Facebook clients that are I'd say users, that rivaled walls I used to see in the intelligence community, given the capacity to worldwide sort of interest. So how do you sort of see the business and regulatory context from where you sit? How do you view it? How do you frame it?
Can you be any more specific? So there's a lot of business and regulatory context in terms of where we sit.
So if you were going to explain to a student
Yeah.
what issues they should be concerned about that you are worried about on your desk.
Yeah, so we were talking about this a little bit at the break. I have thought a lot about what experience means in our field, because I'm not exactly sure what the experience is that prepares you for the Edward Snowden revelations, for instance. Like what was the right experience on June 5th, 2013, if you knew the Washington Post story was going to break the next day? I think there are any number of different things that are certainly helpful to go into that experience knowing. It sounds like Gen students would be prepared to understand a little bit about 215. That certainly is helpful when you read the Post story. I think if you had served on the intelligence committees, if you had served at the CIA or at the FBI, I think that would obviously be helpful background to know. But I'm not exactly sure what the exact right experience is to prepare you for that. I think it's much more about being in a position where you can absorb new information, whatever that might be, across a wide range of different disciplines, and integrate that information into a company's policy goals as quickly as possible, and then formulate solutions that maybe aren't even necessarily the best answers, but are 80% of the way there, and you're doing it in a very short amount of time. I'm confronted by this all the time in my job. So I remember 4 years ago when I was at Facebook, and we were just starting to think about telecom mobile policy issues, and this was at a time when 0% of our revenue was from our mobile app. And I forget, I actually don't even know what the number is now, but I think, then we were 20% of our revenue was from our mobile app, then 40%. My guess, I think it's probably above 50% right now. And all of a sudden, then you're doing mobile public policy issues, and you're doing them in a whole new, you're doing them about a whole range of issues that maybe haven't been confronted before, issues related to native advertising, for instance. We purchased Oculus, which is a virtual reality company. Now all of a sudden, I'm doing virtual reality policy. We launched an artificial intelligence laboratory in Paris. Now I'm doing artificial intelligence work. We purchased WhatsApp, I guess about 2 years ago, and now we've got a whole range of different issues related to over-the-top telecommunications regulation. We've got issues related to national security in the WhatsApp context that are new and emerging. I don't think it's possible to anticipate from a legal from the academy's perspective what the issue is going to be that's going to emerge in 6 months or a year. And so I think it's important to think about the substance that you're teaching in terms of conveying certain skills that students would be able to use when they encounter things that you couldn't anticipate.
Sure.
And I actually would say like one thing related to, I think Jen and Andrew spoke about this and Greg spoke about it as well. This and Kevin mentioned it last night. This effort that we're working on about cross-border data flows. I think it's important to not just understand exactly what any particular legal landscape looks like at a specific moment, but to really try to have students engaged or develop the skills in creative policymaking such that they can look for solutions that you might not have ever been able to anticipate. When we started in the cross-border work, I think we didn't anticipate, we thought that it was a really hard problem to think about, would there be situations where you could come directly to companies to get access to user data and to do that in a way that was human rights protective? And I think when we started the work, we thought the answer was probably no, but there was a diverse group of people engaged in a hard conversation to really try to get at the depth, like at deep opportunities for creative policymaking in that area. And I think when we expanded into that, we were able to find a range of solutions that were pretty interesting.
Great. I know it's hard looking at me, but I've actually been teaching for over 40 years. And I started quite young. And the concept which Jamie alluded to is, and I'm a former dean of a law school, is that you're looking at the ability to be analytical is the goal of law school. So you really want the skill of an analytical mind, hopefully tempered with an ethical backbone. And the issue there is, what Paul alluded to in the first time, in a way it doesn't make a difference what you're teaching, as long as it's a body of knowledge that allows you to question the student. Because the goal, as we said, Jamie, is not for the professor to demonstrate how clever they are, but to make the students more analytical and give them what they need to make them clever. As Ben alluded to, clearly the products that we're producing have been quite helpful, and they have a real analytical ability. So then I guess the question for you, Kristen, is that how are you approaching this sort of sense where you do the business and regulatory approach? How do your courses or classes sort of try to resolve that issue in a way that you think it makes sound pedagogy?
So I'm teaching the business and regulatory issues in the context of a broader course on cybersecurity. So we're spending about 4 classes, so about 2 weeks out of 13 on business and regulatory issues, at least very focused ones. But I think the general question of how you approach this requires some thought depending on where you think your students are headed in particular. So which issues face which particular businesses can vary a lot. If you're talking about working at a tech company, those are very different issues from working at a bank or working at a retail company in-house or being outside counsel for one of those companies. So basically what I try and do in situating the students with respect to the business issues is to think, to go back to Jen's point about fundamentals, what are the basic fundamentals that they need to know that would then be adaptable to whatever particular business context they're facing. So I try and give them the basics like, first of all, what are the threats facing businesses? So what are the range of sort of actor-based threats that the businesses could be confronted with? And then also go through the legal risks. And on the legal risk side, again, taking the perspective of just sort of a general business approach, we talk about things like the SEC disclosure guidance. If you're a company thinking about what do you put in your annual report, what do you have to do after an incident happens, the SEC is very important. We also talk about legal risks from state data breach laws and also from consumer suits from individuals who may, if the company loses their data, what's the exposure to litigation there? And more recently, what's the exposure to regulatory actions by the FTC in response to weak cybersecurity practices? Now, you could expand this as well. And there are a lot of things that affect businesses. We talked yesterday about civil suit provisions, the civil suit provision under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, for example, and also about hacking back. So I think if you take sort of a broad view of business issues, there's a lot that you could talk about, but I really try and focus in on kind of the core business questions that would be generally applicable no matter what kind of business they're in. And then you can obviously scale that or drill down in more detail on sector-specific concerns for HIPAA or regulation of financial institutions. And I try and mention to them that those exist, but give them the basic tools to scale to whatever business they're addressing.
Great. So Andrew, I'll let you get in.
Yeah,
on
can I
what
answer
comes
the
in.
same question?
Yeah.
Just because I've given this a lot of thought. I just
Yeah.
finished teaching a class that was an attempt, I think, just to answer that question, and similar with what both Paul and Matt said about experiential learning in the context of a very rapidly evolving field. So, the class started when last spring a student came to my office and asked me whether I knew anything about Swiss privacy law. Now, I teach at the University of Kentucky, where you don't get a lot of people practicing Swiss law.
I think that shocks all of us.
And I actually, so I said, well, I know a little bit about Swiss banking law. I've done some work on cross-border law enforcement that involved conflicts with Swiss blocking statutes. So I wanted to know why she wanted to know, and I knew that she was a very good student. She was on her way out, graduating 3L, who had gotten a good job at a local company called Big Ass Fans. Big Ass Fans is, some of you may know the company. It's a Lexington, Kentucky company, but they advertise every week in the New York Times Magazine. They make very nice, big ass fans. They're doing just gangbusters. They made $250 million in sales last year. I mean, the growth curve is like this. So she got a job as the number 2 in the general counsel's office. And for the first 10 years of the company's history, the general counsel was doing labor stuff and contract stuff. Last year, they introduced a fan that has a sensor on it that talks to your wireless network. So it speaks to your Nest thermostat. You drive into your driveway, and it knows your home, and it spins all the fans on in the house. Their biggest markets are Brazil, Japan, and Switzerland. They're collecting data about their customers, right? This is why she wanted to know about Swiss law. So I said, well, can you tell me where you store the data that you're collecting about your customers? And she's like, oh, I better go check. So she checked, and then she came back. She's like, we think it's stored here in Kentucky. So I said, oh my God. First of all, let me be clear. I'm not admitted to the bar here in Kentucky. A, B, you're my student. I can't be giving you advice unless you want to pay me for it. But my strong sense is that it's hugely problematic that A, you don't know where the data is, and B, you might be storing it here instead of keeping it with somebody who will have had a legal team already figure out what's the best way to store it and how to be compliant with many different legal regimes. So anyway, I talked to a number of people about this and realized this is a growing field, right? I mean, the Internet of Things is a real thing, and so I created a class that was meant to be a simulation to get students to try to solve problems like this. So of course we had the general counsel from Big Ass Fans come speak. But I wasn't sure how to approach the topic because it seemed like students had such a diverse set of interests, and the topic is just, as everyone's identified, just way, way too large. So kind of similar to how Jen starts class, I asked the students to present on topics that mattered to them, and it wasn't quite as sophisticated as Paul's approach, but I wanted them to, I think it's insane that you would graduate law school and not learn how to use PowerPoint. I mean, business students emerge from business school with some of the skills, professional skills they need to use in the real world where you're interacting with other humans. You can go through 3 years of law school and not get better interacting with other humans. You could get much worse. That's right. And this may be to Judge Baker's EQ point. I mean, I think we don't do a good enough job on EQ stuff. So I asked them to run the class as a simulation and asked them to pick topics, and the class, we've only had one semester, but the class was incredible. And they picked some of the most interesting topics. So they briefed the Intelligence Committee. That was one simulated session. So some students chose to brief a community board about whether the community foundation should buy cybersecurity insurance. One class briefed the board of a retail company about whether to spend more on cybersecurity defenses. And to everyone's surprise in the class, they convinced the board that it actually didn't make sense to spend more than the company was already spending because the financial intermediaries were going to absorb many of the costs if the company got hit, and the marginal benefit of spending more on what they're already spending wasn't really worth it. So that was a shocking conclusion. And our best class was students who chose to brief the class The class was simulating a drug distributing gang, and the question they asked the group of gang members was, should we switch our cash operations to Bitcoin? What do you think they concluded?
Yes.
No. The answer was cash is way more anonymous than Bitcoin. Way better if you're trying to avoid detection to have cash than Bitcoin. So anyway, the point is having students pick topics they're really interested in, I think is really important here. And the other thing is experiential learning doesn't just mean learning how to code, because what lawyers end up doing isn't coding, it's explaining complicated things to people who know even less than they do. Boards, senators, whoever it is. So that process has been enlightening, and it's only one semester deep, but I'm hoping to learn more.
So that's the skill base, because usually the greatest driver of curriculum is actually the board of bar examiners. So we have always at the ABA realized that if you want to have a topic put on the curriculum of a university, if the board is going to be asked questions on that issue area to become a lawyer in a specific state, that's how you drive curriculum. So it's an interesting thing you don't think about, but that's how we've done it. So at the ABA, at the task force that we set up on cyber and the law with Judy Miller, who I think many of you know, the lawyer, not the reporter, we divided the world into three areas. One pot was the law firm, and trying to get law firms to figure out how to think about cyber. And then the second pot was the critical infrastructure. And I raise that because people often say the private sector, but there really isn't a private sector in the United States. There are what we know as the 16 critical infrastructures. And the financial services is regulated a certain way versus the electrical grid, the FERC and the NERC, versus another infrastructure. So what's interesting is Facebook sort of sits on outside of that historic regulation, but yet the way it's bumping up into the world is two ways. One is privacy-related issues, and the second bucket that we did, which Facebook did, is the international regimes, the international bucket. So if you look at the regimes that, the regime complex for managing global cyber activities, we have, there's a report that was done by the famous Joe Nye called the Regime Complex for Managing Global Cyber Activities. And he has a schematic, which I'll put up and give to Bobby. 26 different organizations are involved in the space. So for the viewing audience, you won't see it, but this is his simple schematic of what you're supposed to deal with. Now, when I teach in law school, we never taught that. There's going to be something on international law coming up, and also something on law of armed conflict. But from your perspective as teachers, the provocative question I'll pose is our curriculum not really suited for really educating our students for the level of advice they're going to be required to have to give, and the sort of intellectual flexibility? Because the same thing like the law firms, we're driven by statutes. So if you're a criminal person, you know you're going to be dealing with Title 18. That's your statute. If you're in intelligence, you're going to be dealing with Title 50. That's your statute. If you're going to be doing military stuff, that's Title 10. That's your statute. But because this cyber thing cuts across the statutes, it's proven to be very difficult for not only the USG, the government, for law firms to figure out how to reorganize themselves in order to deal with this issue, and for the United States military to try to figure it out. So we have sources like Lawfare and Just Security, in which people go because as soon as something happens, that becomes the focal point to quickly get some good analysis on it. But in the academy, we are still set up in the same way. If you started law school in 1910, the curriculum of your first year is quite similar. The content has changed dramatically. But given the cyber challenge, which is why we're here, I want to ask you, so do you think we should thinking much more radically about how we should understand the curriculum versus the way we traditionally did it? And you as a user of the lawyers, what would be your reaction if you could get the deans together and say, this is what I would like to have your students. I understand they have to be flexible and agile, but here's some subset issues I really would like them to start focusing on, problem centered as opposed to the way you historically have done it.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting to hear you say that the orientation would be statute-driven, because I just don't think of any problem that comes across my desk as statute-driven. In that there's never anything that comes my way and someone says, like, you know, I guess there would be, you know, legal reforms where it would clearly be prior statute and reform opportunity, but it typically is that a problem comes across your desk, right? And then you have to figure out a way to solve the problem, and the problem might have, obviously, like you have to understand the statute in order to solve the problem, but the orientation is around problems. And so I guess from my standpoint, like in terms of the education that you'd want to, in terms of what you would want students to learn, it would be, what are the various tools that I can go to when I face a particular problem? And I've found, since I started my job, so I'm not a lobbyist, I run basically like a policy planning team. I've always envied the people who are incredible at lobbying. So one of the people—
You have lobby envy?
I have lobby envy. I have deep lobby envy, actually. So one of my close friends at Facebook left to become the head of policy at Uber, and he was the first head of policy there, and he had a skill set that I never had, which is Des Moines shuts down Uber. What do you do? And that, I actually think, like for the kinds of practitioners that you want in the field, that is a skill set that just didn't come in my legal education or my policy education. I have a policy degree as well. And I think that orienting around what are the types of things that you do when you face those real world problems is a really important thing for the academy to consider.
And you realize that'd be such a radical change from the way the law schools currently are driven, because you take the 1030 course on computer fraud and abuse, right?
Yeah.
You take the Title 18 course for criminal procedure. We're not problem centered.
Yeah.
We're actually statutory centered. So what is your guys' reactions to that?
So I agree that that cybersecurity is a problem-centered problem, I guess, and should be approached that way. I don't think that's actually that radical of a shift. And I think you can do it in a cybersecurity class, and something that I try and do in my class. I mean, I think we're in a field-defining period, and what you're describing is, you know, the government's trying to define it, the academy's trying to define it, law firms are trying to define it. So particularly with respect to the business and regulatory context, I worked on these issues in a law firm, so I'm not actually that far away from trying to grapple with these issues myself as a practicing lawyer. And so I'm trying to replicate for my students what are the things I wish I had known and what did I have to get up to speed on. And I think what cybersecurity classes can do is help them sort of speed their progression up the learning curve when they get into a particular situation. And I think one thing that's, to go back to your question about, well, there's no statute here.
Right.
One thing that I discuss explicitly with my students is, why is that? It's actually very counterintuitive to them. They're like, you know, I get questions from the students like, well, why don't we have regulations? Where are the regulations? So we talk about that, like, how did we get here? Why is it the case that you have the FTC bringing enforcement actions, and yet there's no sort of specific cybersecurity regulations underlying it that you can point to and the businesses can go to for details. So I think it's helpful in teaching. I put a much greater emphasis in the cybersecurity class than I would in other classes on thinking through the policy issues and trying to situate them and say, okay, you know, imagine you're a lawyer, an in-house lawyer in a tech company, and you're faced with this legislative proposal. What do you think about it? How does it change the existing law? What's your perspective on it? Because this is an area that's so much in flux that I think that is a skill set that's extremely important.
Yeah, and I agree with all that. I would also just add too that there's this. Those of you who don't currently work in a law school don't maybe not know this, but the ABA's got this new requirement that a certain number of credit hours come from experiential learning, and law schools are flipping out for the most part because clinical learning is very expensive, right? Clinics are expensive to run, and so to ramp up the clinic so that everyone takes 6 credits of clinical classes is a huge new cost on the school. And so schools are trying to figure out, is there non-clinical experiential learning that we can do? And I taught my class as an attempt to try to see if a simulation might count as experiential, real-world training that was non-clinical. And I'm hopeful that I'm going to teach the class again, and I hope again after that. And the thought is that maybe cyber is one of these new cutting-edge areas where the student interest that drives a lot of it is enough to spark some change and create a space where we can define better what it means experiential learning, and maybe in the process shake up legal education a little bit. And I really like the idea of Matt's, you know, Des Moines shuts down Uber, or Delhi shuts down Uber. Let's have a weekend simulation where everybody has to work in groups and solve a real-world problem rather than just. And then it might, and of course, it's going to involve statutes, but it's not just read the case and regurgitate it.
This has sparked interest in the audience. Why don't you ask?
Yes, interesting.
Say who you are, so for the record we'll know.
I'm Victoria Sutton, professor of law at Texas Tech, University School of Law. And when, much like nanotechnology, biotechnology, those cross-cutting issues that cut across disciplines as well as code books, one of the ways that I've organized teaching those areas is to solve a problem like the Uber shutdown problem, is to take the application in admin law, what's the application in constitutional law, examples in each one of the doctrinal areas, and you'll see there are usually repeating themes in those doctrinal areas for a particular technology. It may be very different for biotech as opposed to nanotech. The issues may be very different, but by applying problems in that technology across disciplines, that's one way of preparing a student to address a technology by knowing what themes may pop up. It's not only issue spotting, but going in a little deeper for the background behind that.
So this is the Eric Jensen problem that you've pointed out. So Eric's by himself, the tall standing oak at BYU teaching national security law, right? Yeah. So hearing this, would you say that, is this a solution? I should do a much more problem-focused way of dealing with the problem? So it's too bad Bill's left, Bill Banks and Dykes, because we talk a lot about the way to move the doctrine is how are you organizing your books? What issues are you putting in them? And why, you know, the Steve Vladeck's and the Bobby Chesney are taking these books and then using them. Is there something, would that appeal to you more if it was a problem-centric issue, or would you say, no, I prefer the books as is and I can get a few chapters and then do it that way?
So I'll bring this up in the panel after lunch, but I take a very problem and scenario-driven approach to all my teaching. So whether the book does it or whether I create the scenarios based on the stuff in the book, I think that presents, I mean, I'm right with you. That's the way most legal problems in my career have presented themselves. I've not presented myself because I was reading a statute and thought, oh, I'm trained. It's been that I've been sitting at my desk and suddenly this problem has arrived on my desk, and then I have to somehow face that problem, figure out what statutes apply, figure out what law is there. And so that's really, again, I'll talk about that later,
Yeah.
but that's really how I approach it, whether it's in the book or not.
So example I'll give you at our firm, we frame the cyber issue as the boom. And the boom is when a company discovers it's been penetrated. So a whole range of problems then ensue, and we're supposed to give legal advice and give a sensibility of where to go. And then we say, well, what have you done left of boom? So what have you done in the regulatory sense beforehand, and what have the lawyers done to help you get ready for this phenomena? And you have to get ready for it. And then right of boom, once you've had the incident, what you were mentioning, Kristen, what do you do for notification? But more importantly, how do you deal with the public information aspect of it? They expect the lawyers to help them assist in that. And the other aspect that's happened is that from the teaching perspective, we have no one institution that handles left, boom, and right of boom. And part of the reason that I think has been that, because there's so many potential conflicts of interest inside the space. So how would you have your students think about that issue to frame it? So you're a perfect example, given you at Facebook. First of all, how large is your law department?
I actually have no idea. I'm not in the law department. I'm in the policy department. My guess is maybe 100 lawyers.
100 lawyers, right?
Yeah.
And so, and how do you, from your perspective, how do you use your lawyers? What's your best way that you operationalize use your lawyers?
Yeah, it's funny. I don't even think of it that way. So I would say that almost every issue that we have has a set of people involved in it. So it will have someone who is responsive to a particular jurisdiction. So that could be a state issue that emerges, so it's someone from our state policy team. It's an issue that emerges in India, so it's someone from our India policy team. And then it will have me or someone from my team who is not a jurisdictional expert, but is an issue expert, so is advising across jurisdictions on a position we would take on law enforcement globally, for instance. we'll have someone from our communications team, because how we think about talking about the issue publicly and in the press is incredibly important. We'll have someone from the legal team to advise on legal matters related to it, and then typically have someone from the product team. And I think that's actually one thing, like I think Andrew mentioned this yesterday, one thing that's really important is there are lots of non-legal solutions to legal problems, and often the most powerful solutions that we have are technological solutions. So one good example of that is we now have a feature called social reporting. And social reporting emerged in response to, I think, what was a legal and policy challenge. So when there's a piece of content, let's say that someone alleges that a particular piece of content is bullying, there are policy and communications reasons we might take that down. There are legal reasons in terms of existing legal regimes, and then also in terms of potential legal regimes that would emerge if people get upset with us because we're not taking down a sufficient amount of material. And there are legal policy communication solutions to that. There's also a product solution, which is what we developed, which is to enable you to report a piece of content not just to Facebook, but to someone else in your community. And so the stats that we have are something like 80% of content surfaced through the social reporting tool is resolved offline rather than online. So a teacher or a parent resolving a bullying issue where they have more context in order to determine an answer. I think I think it's more, I think by having like holistic groups of people involved in the solutions, you come up with a bunch of different avenues that aren't just purely legal in nature.
So would you advocate opening up our educational doctrines so that we'd have more people, let's say, from the business school, more people from the computer science programs, more people from a policy entity? That's how we should be thinking about law school in the future? Or will because one of the 3-year model, has been under review for a very long time by guys like John Sexton. And also we're in basically a legal educational crisis at the moment, with people looking and say, many law schools the enrollment is down, and one of the issues is, are we still relevant for what students need to have in this space, or is this an opportunity us to really, because you're the wizards. The people in this room are the wizards who control the curriculum and control, now that you're the next generation, you have an opportunity to say, we want to rethink what we want to do here, and cyber is giving us this opportunity to do it because it's an opportunity. Given what Matt has just said, what would be, when you go back to your law schools, are you going to say, this is a really interesting seminar because I'm rethinking how I should put together the cases and the issues, and I have to talk to the deans about what we want to do here?
Yeah, so I think a couple things. One thing that comment reminded me of is that 2 of the people that were sitting in my seminar were lawyers in Lexington they were alum who wanted to take the class. And it's much easier for me to pitch something to my dean as if it's radical, if there's a ton of student demand and there's a ton of alumni demand for students who are trained up in a particular area. So this just is like, if you're going to pick something that's to test the waters on something interdisciplinary, this is a really great subject. I think again, the ABA experiential requirement is also a nice place because schools are willing. It's a nice opportunity to play a little bit. Schools are willing to say, all right, let's try something different. That's not totally radical. We understand what 3 credit hours is, so we'll just give you 3 credit hours to test something out.
Well, let me ask you this, because as teachers, so there's the D word, the dreaded D word, distance learning. So that has become very popular in the military. And I don't know how many of the people in the room have actually run a distance learning course or a MOOC. So we have only one hand that's gone up, and I've done it. And I'm curious about, first of all, why have none of you explored the distance learning issue? And the ABA says, I think you can take 6 credits that are from distance learning. So let me pose to the panel or anyone else in the room, and then we'll go to the one who's read it. Why have you not experimented with that? Because as soon as this issue came up with Paul, Ben and I both said, oh, why don't you just do a video? Why don't you start coming on and doing it and taping this? And then we can really scale you, because you're not scalable currently. Is there something about our educational Socratic method that is not conducive to distance learning, and we should hold on to that, even though for most deans, that would be an incredibly cost-effective way to deal with the costs of a law school. So what is your collective reason? Because you're supposed to be the young new generation who is embracing the technology, but none of you, except for one or two, raised their hand about they're interested in learning about MOOCs and distance learning.
So I participated in a MOOC that I didn't run, but that was run out of Georgetown. It had many thousands of participants all over the world, from which I received 0 questions.
You were just too obtuse?
I was, as you know, I have a very unengaging presence. And I don't, you know, I'm not at tour and, you know, not
Right.
very interesting.
Yeah.
And so, you know, in a reflection of that,
Yeah.
you know, with thousands of participants around the world, it generated not a single email question or even referred question through the Georgetown Government Department. And I walked away from that with, you know, I was reasonably well compensated for the project, so it certainly wasn't a waste of my time. But I did walk away with the sense that as a purely educational matter, eye contact matters. And that, you know, there's, and if I think about my own education, such as it is, you know, the experience of engagement with the professors or people who taught me is not incidental to it. And so I walked away with the idea that the MOOC is actually pretty overrated.
So let me just add on to that. In addition to just the eye contact between the student and the professor, I think there's a tremendous amount to be gained going back to the experiential pieces of the interaction of the students with each other. So my class tends to involve, we tend to do a lot of debates where I either assign roles or let students pick roles. And I also do a lot of sort of straw polls. Like we start out with a question and ask people to vote, like, what do you think of this? Are you on one side or the other? And then at the end, we do another vote and their positions have shifted. So there's a learning that's happening because of the interpersonal engagement. And I would also be concerned with that would be lost in the MOOC context.
I guess I don't quite understand why it has to be so categorical. Like, I remember a discussion I was having with someone about whether I should make my lunch in the morning and bring it to work, or whether I should get a sandwich and pay for it in the middle of the workday. And I was like going on and on about the rationales of the two different approaches and like how I would justify the budget like to myself of spending money on a sandwich each day. And the person said, why don't you just make your lunch some days and then buy lunch some days? And I was like, holy shit, that's amazing.
You're now scaring us, given how smart you are. This is what this is a revelation.
Right, well, but it's applicable to this conversation. Like, I don't understand how you're not going to be able to do MOOCs and like survive as an institution. Like, you're going to have to do MOOCs. And I don't understand how you could like not teach practitioner oriented classes and survive. That said, like all or nothing seems like a weird approach too. I mean, I love my job, I learn a ton in my job, but it's pretty superficial life. Like none of the issues I cover do I cover in any amount of depth. I mean, if I was to explain to you how I think about IP policy, anyone in the room who knows even a little bit about IP policy, I think would be embarrassed for me that I know so little about it. And so I don't think that like a pure practitioner orientation to a law school seems like a good way to encourage students to like really engage in depth with material, and you want depth to be part of your students' lives. That said, you got to have some practitioner element to.
Well, you're a perfect example. So the days you bring your lunch,
Now I work at Facebook. Yeah, Facebook trumped the question.
But hypothetically, the day you would bring your lunch, you'd be able to sit in your terminal and actually view a video or a MOOC. Have you ever done that? Have you ever actually gone online and looked at YouTube or taken a lecture?
Yeah, I have, and we also thought. I mean, obviously, it's like relevant to Facebook as a product as well. So we've thought about different ways to include educational services in some of the work that we're doing. So yeah, I think it's going to be around, and it's going to require some figuring out, but it's going to be around.
How many people know have actually viewed a YouTube lecture, let's say by Gary King or someone like that, or someone? So I'd say about 30%, 40%, 30% of the room. Actually, quite fascinating.
Harvey, let me jump in.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
I completely agree with Matt about buy it in, make it as the case suits, and more specifically, tailor it to what you're trying to accomplish. So we actually basically have in legal education the bifurcated model already, because it seems like just about everybody actually prepares for the bar not so much by going to law school, but after law school, taking Barbary or whatever the provider is.
Right.
And it varies exactly how it's delivered, but it's basically a MOOC, right? The lectures, Stanley Johansson is teaching the entire country trust in the states.
Think about that, right?
It really is touch more lawyers than anybody,
Yeah.
but he creates one set of content. It's often by video. Sometimes it's live, but it could just as well be by video. So we use it for basic transmission of memorizable and regurgitatable knowledge at a level that's required for the bar exam.
Mhm.
But for law school, the whole reason why law school is something different from that is we're trying to teach higher order thinking, writing, and skills of interacting with people, these problem-solving skills. We don't necessarily, no one's got it just right, but there are things being done there that can't be done, I think, through that MOOC model for the reasons that have been mentioned. And I think that the wave of the future for legal education in the JD programs is, there is clearly, some schools more than others, but for everybody, there's going to be some encroachment of the MOOC type content delivery into the basic elements. Maybe the first year type courses are going to see more and more intrusion there. And then there needs to be a good pedagogical case for what you're doing at the second and third year, including the exact kind of things that Andrew's talking about, where you get these hyper-creative approaches that may well require some interdisciplinarity as well, co-teaching, and I think we all should be spending time thinking about that, not just in the cyber context, but certainly in the
So
cyber
I used to say that I could probably take some of my brightest undergraduate students from social studies at Harvard, and many of them were very talented standardized test takers. And I said I could probably take them, send them to a bar prep course for 6 weeks, and they would probably pass the bar. So the question, what was the role and function of law school? And that's what you put your finger on, that I think the cyber issue is really bringing to fore, given the crisis. What is the magical aspect going on in the classes? And why we should be able to maintain this model of a 3-year model versus a 2-year model with something else going on with other types of clinics is really something that we should be thinking about as the leaders. But Dina, you have a question.
Yeah, I was just going to make a comment about MOOCs. I think that they're developing in a way that people are accepting them much more. I mean, if you look at the TED Talks, those are essentially a type of MOOC, and they're incredibly popular. And our TED Radio Hour at NPR is one of our most popular shows now, and growing faster than many of the other shows for exactly this reason. I think people have learned not only how to produce them, but also how to consume them in a way. And if you look, there are lots and lots of questions and comments underneath all these YouTube versions of the TED Radio Hour.
So
So it could well have been Ben.
I would say the other example is, I think you're all familiar with Serial.
Yeah.
Well, just think about that from a legal perspective. How is it that this story became so powerful? And all the law schools who were involved in ACLU issues and trying to represent any individuals, this radio show became much more effective in a way of raising the issue. And I think all of us should be thinking, why is that from a law perspective? But we have one more question back there. Yes,
I
ma'am.
was just going to comment on the online course. In the big universe of all these, they're called either synchronous or asynchronous. I'm
Right.
sure you've heard that. So I wanted to experiment with asynchronous.
And explain, asynchronous is basically you put up the content, student takes it down when they want to do it, and it's not a live interaction that's taking place.
That's right. So the challenge then is how do you do a Socratic method like that? So again, just a lot of thoughts. So I want to throw this out here and see what your thoughts are about this. So I did a 10-minute lecture and then a 5-question quiz. 10-minute lecture, 5-question quiz to try to simulate what we do in class. In a lecture and then feedback and answer to 5 questions. But that ended up being 115 quizzes for the semester. That's what it adds up to, by the way. So it was a huge amount of work, but it was an experiment. So in order to try to just assess how this worked, I, of course, went through the IRB approval process to experiment and assess how this compared to the in class experience with students, because I found there were very few asynchronous courses at law school for obvious reasons. So, I'll be happy to share that paper, by the way.
Sure.
decide is, lecture, quiz. So any way that you could change that, they did. One of them was, I'd ask them a question, and I seriously thought I wouldn't get any responses. Were you ever doing these things while watching the lecture?
Sure.
Babysitting. That was a very big check mark.
So they're multitaskers.
That's right.
But my experience with Eichensehr is, so I did this and then I decided to phone the students to have a real dialogue with them. So I did it with a few of them, and then one of the comments was like, why did the professor want to speak to me directly? Like, maybe like Ben, my own personality, but it was like, isn't that why you're paying the money for tuition? But it was a totally different psychological role of the students.
Can I
But
say
any
one
other
thing?
comments?
Yeah, just one other thing about this. I mean, it seems like there is a structural problem here that it goes far beyond this particular topic. But when you asked, you said you guys are the young, cutting-edge
Yeah.
generation, and why aren't you blazing new trails in legal education? And my quip response is tenure. But my serious,
Sure.
right, but my serious response is tenure. I mean, I actually think that the people who come into law schools and are the youngest and closest to a hot topic and who are going to be closest to the students in age and want to feed off of their enthusiasm and innovate some new class, someone might counsel them, I'm just suggesting hypothetically, might counsel them not to rock the boat and not to try an experiential class. And I don't know if I would have been able to design my class if it hadn't been for the ABA's experiential requirement.
Fascinating.
If I
Eric.
were your academic affairs dean, I would encourage you.
Thanks, Bobby.
Well done, Bobby.
So, Harvey, I think you're raising an issue that obviously goes far beyond cyber and far beyond law school.
Yeah.
Vicki and I go to a conference each year at ASU that's talking about emerging technologies. And we had a guy there from Google last year. And he makes the point that whether it's Google Glasses or over time a Google implant in your brain, facts and figures will not be what you go to school for. Because you will have access to all of that at your fingertips or at your eye blink or just automatically in your brain. And so how do we, with respect to legal education or education more generally, turn it into something where it's your expertise, it's your analysis, it's your methodology of presenting the facts, and what you do with the facts that makes the educational environment of value, not the facts. I mean, we read the case books, they're going to read the case books, but it's how we get them to understand what those principles are. And then I think, we work in a generation that is used to getting information via podcasts, et cetera, et cetera. We grew up where it was you either read it or you heard it from some live source. That's obviously not how they do it now, but that still doesn't answer the question of how you get that information. Where's the value added of an education institution, given all the media, all the ways they can get facts in?
I say for my 2 cents.
Yes.
The value add is that we're going to teach people how to take a sea of facts, figure out which ones are the ones that matter, how to defend that position that you're going to build, which has to have normative elements built into it. And you have to, that's something you can't just access on demand what the normative foundations are going to be. How to attack the argument that someone else is making you think is wrong, and how to process all that, and maybe evolve your position. That's the thing that, unless and until AI proceeds to, Darren can comment on this, we're not quite there yet, are we, Darren?
Not quite there yet.
Maybe AI is going to also supplant that, but for now, I think that the intrusion that the MOOC factual content delivery model can get you is kind of limited to that part.
So then are we building our law classes, our cyber law classes to do that now? And is that
No, and I think that you put your finger on a general question. I think the reality is for most faculty across schools, disciplines, and institutions, most people, the way their course is currently is entirely path dependent on how they happen to have done it when they first developed that course, which may be many years in the distant path. There's this trust that, well, of course, I know I've been delivering good content, so why would I re-examine it? It's a helpful exercise for everybody to be forced to say out loud, what are my course objectives? And I actually had a message from someone watching the live stream a minute ago saying you should be talking about what are the course objectives. Then from there, and you better have a sophisticated answer to that that's responsive to these types of concerns, and whether it's cyber or something else, be able to justify what you're asking the students to do and what you then measure and grade them on with reference to those objectives.
You want to say something?
Yeah, well, let me just jump in on that. I mean, I think one thing that's on the objective side that's particularly responsive for, or particularly relevant for a cybersecurity class, something that my students, at the beginning of the semester, I see them struggle with, is we're reading sort of these factual accounts of what's happened in particular cybersecurity incidents, and they get very worried about the facts. And then when they come into class, I say, okay, well, you're reading this as a lawyer. Like, you need to learn your role, and you're going to encounter these situations in practice. You will be there as the lawyer. You will not be there as the technologist. So teaching them the skill of how do you go from technical facts in particular and pull out what's legally relevant. I think that's one thing that should be particularly an objective of the cybersecurity class.
Josh?
Going back to your geek wonk divide,
Mhm.
this is a little off the online topic, but we're looking at some courses that are joint courses with our upper division or graduate level CS.
That's
folks
computer
being,
science.
You know, being team taught by their professors and our law folks, and I'm wondering if you all have done any of that and seen experience or success with
Right.
it.
There are some schools that are doing, NYU is doing a joint sort of reached out, I know Drexel did. And there are a number of schools are trying to reconfigure the curriculum. But I guess the last one, the time has just flown for me anyways. It's hard to imagine. You only have 3 minutes. But one of the issues that I want to raise, and we'll get Ben involved, is that one of the things that's very powerful, what you hope of a legal education, then when you're in practice, is how persuasive you are. Can you make persuasive arguments is one of the core elements of all of our classes. So Ben, you're not a lawyer per se, but you're very, very persuasive, and lawfare has been a very persuasive tool as just security. So my question to you is, what do you think the skills that contributed to you becoming a persuasive speaker? Greg, you're a lawyer, so I'm not going to ask you your, but what do you think, and how do you hone your idea about how you make persuasive policy arguments?
Well, I mean, the speaking skills is a different skill set from the writing skills,
Mhm.
honestly. The speaking skills I had to learn. When I was 23, I was asked to go on what was then the McNeil Lehrer NewsHour
Mhm.
to talk about a story that I had written at my then newspaper, Legal Times, and I was so nervous that apparently they put me in a swivel chair, and I spent the entire and the producer actually called up and yelled at me afterwards, and told me I had embarrassed her. And so
Just for swiveling, or was
yes,
it?
she told me you look very nervous swiveling in your chair. And years later, my wife ran into a producer from that show and mentioned this, and the producer said, sort of aghast, "Oh my God, your husband is the swiveler." So I have like
Legendary.
my Batman villain.
I'm trying to Google that right now.
So I mean, I think, look, learning how to speak on camera and in public settings is a skill. Well, I had a very specific set of training in persuasive writing, which was that I wrote editorials every day for the Washington Post for 10 years, and that's a style of experiential learning that is both a unusual set of training in substantive law and because you have to know the substantive law of what you're writing about well enough to write about it for a general interest audience, which is actually people think of that as a shallow level of knowledge. It's actually a deep level of knowledge. And you also have to be able to do it in 4 paragraphs, which gets to the question of brevity being not merely the soul of wit, but some level of mastery of the subject matter. But you also have to be able to write 4 persuasive paragraphs, right? And so I mean, I do think there's a type of writing that you all train to in law school, which is essentially brief writing in one sense or another. And that is a very different style of writing, a different style of persuasive writing than the kind that I sort of grew up with professionally. I think there is room in a lot of lawyers' lives know more about the both written and oral communication about law with non-lawyers. And I think that's, I've always had this joke, I've never had a law school dean take me up on it, that I, would love to teach a class of legal writing for non-lawyers. That is not teaching non-lawyers to write about law, but teaching lawyers and law students to write about law for non-legal audiences. And I've never had anybody express actual interest in doing it, and yet if you pause a moment and think about like the people who do that well, that there's actually, whether your preference is Dahlia Lithwick or Stuart Taylor or Jeff Rosen, or there's this group of people who do that at a level that we all want to read, and there's something deep that's being communicated in that we are not teaching as part of a basic legal education, either about cyber security or about anything else. And it's a worthwhile question whether that sort of writing should be more part of
Well,
the discussion.
hopefully there'll be 200 potential deans watching this, so you may have a new opportunity. We have to wrap up, but does Bobby or any of the panelists, or Jamie, do you want to say any last words? Well then, please join me in thanking the panelists for a fascinating meeting.